I was in the middle of explaining the load-bearing tolerances on the Harmon Bridge retrofit when my new supervisor walked in, straightened his jacket, and told me he'd take it from here. I'd been with Mercer Infrastructure for 22 years. I knew every bolt pattern, every soil report, every inspector's name in 3 counties. And I was sitting there, in front of the state DOT project director, watching a 34-year-old with a master's degree in business administration and 0 hours of field experience tell a room full of engineers that the project was directionally sound but needed strategic realignment. I looked at the project director. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything. That was the beginning of the end. I just didn't know it yet. My name is not important. What I did for 22 years is, I was a senior structural engineer at Mercer Infrastructure Solutions, a mid-sized civil engineering firm out of Columbus, Ohio. We handled bridges, overpasses, highway interchanges. The kind of work where getting it wrong doesn't mean a bad quarter, it means people die. I started there fresh out of Ohio State, 26 years old, carrying a PE license and a lunch pail. I worked my way up from project engineer to senior project lead to, eventually, the guy everyone called when something complicated landed on the table. About half of our revenue came from state and federal contracts, transportation projects, Army Corps of Engineers work, a few DOT partnerships that had been built over decades through relationships, track records, and the kind of institutional knowledge you can't put in a PowerPoint. I was the technical lead on most of those. I knew the federal procurement process. I knew what the Army Corps wanted to see in a specs package. I knew which inspectors were going to push back and what questions they'd ask on site. My immediate boss, the man who'd hired me and promoted me twice, retired 3 years ago. Good man. He understood what the work actually was. What came after him was different. The company brought in a new VP of operations. I'll call him the VP, because that's what he was. Early 40s, MBA from a decent school, resume full of efficiency initiatives and cost restructuring at companies that made consumer products, packaging, retail logistics, things where the margin of error is measured in dollars, not structural integrity. He arrived in January. By March, he had renamed 3 departments. By April, he'd introduced a project management software system that none of the engineers could figure out how to use for actual engineering tasks. By May, he had reorganized the Federal Contracts Division, my division, under his direct oversight and installed his own deputy to coordinate between the technical team and his office. The deputy's name was Kyle. Kyle was 29. He had a project management certification and had previously worked in commercial real estate development. He wore slim-fit suits to job sites and once asked me, in complete seriousness, why we couldn't just use the same structural drawings from the last bridge project for the new one. They're both bridges, he said. What's different? I explained what was different. He nodded like he understood. He didn't. The first real problem came in September. We were competing for a federal highway contract, a major interchange reconstruction outside of Dayton, roughly $34 million. I'd spent 8 weeks on the technical proposal. I knew the review panel. I knew the federal evaluators who'd be scoring it. I'd worked with 2 of them on a previous project 4 years earlier, and I knew exactly what they weighted in a bid submission. The VP decided Kyle should present the proposal. Kyle's been embedded in this from day one, he told me. It's good for his development. I said with complete professionalism that I had concerns about that approach given the technical complexity of the review. The VP said, I hear you, but this is a growth opportunity. I drove to Dayton. I sat in the back of that room while Kyle presented. 15 minutes in, the lead federal reviewer stopped him and asked a very specific question about our load analysis methodology for the soil conditions near the creek bed on the eastern approach. It was a technical question, the kind you answer from memory if you've spent 8 weeks writing the proposal. Kyle looked at his slides. He looked at his notes. He said he'd follow up. We did not get that contract. I was not surprised. I was, however, tired. I want to be honest about something. I'd been quietly frustrated for months before that. Not just about Kyle, not just about the VP. I'd watched the company start making decisions that seemed to optimize for the appearance of efficiency rather than actual performance. Headcount was being reduced on field teams. Inspection timelines were getting compressed. There was a push to standardize our proposals, use templates, reduce customization, win volume. For residential subdivision drainage work, maybe that makes sense. For federal infrastructure contracts built on specific technical relationships? It doesn't. I had raised these concerns internally, twice in writing to the VP. Once verbally to his boss, our CEO, who I'd known for 12 years. The CEO listened politely. He told me change was hard and that the VP was bringing fresh perspective. I stopped raising concerns after that. December came. The VP called me into his office. He told me the company was restructuring the technical leadership model, and that going forward, Kyle would be leading client-facing activities for the federal portfolio. I would remain the senior technical resource, which meant I would do the work, and Kyle would be in the room where the work was presented. I asked, point blank, whether my role was being redefined. He said, think of it as an evolution. I said, an evolution toward what? He said, look, you're a great engineer, but the company needs people who can scale. You've been doing this the same way for 20 years. That has value, but it's not the only kind of value. I went home that night and sat in my garage for about an hour. My wife came out around 9 o'clock and didn't say anything. She just handed me a cup of coffee and sat in the other chair. She'd heard enough over the past year to know when I needed quiet more than conversation. Eventually she said, what are you going to do? I said I didn't know yet. That was December 14th. By January 3rd I knew. A colleague I'd worked with on a DOT project 6 years earlier had started his own firm, Precision Structural Group, based in Cincinnati. Smaller than Mercer, but growing fast and specifically focused on federal and state transportation contracts. He'd reached out to me twice in the past 2 years, and I'd declined both times because I was loyal to Mercer and thought things would improve. I called him on January 4th. We met for lunch in Cincinnati on the 8th. I drove back to Columbus with a written offer in my jacket pocket. Before I accepted it, I did one thing I want to be clear about. I talked to a lawyer. I had a non-solicitation agreement with Mercer. I could not contact their clients and invite them to follow me. I was not going to do that. What I could do was take my expertise, my PE license, and my knowledge to a competitor and do excellent work. The clients could make their own choices. I gave my notice on January 22nd. The VP received it professionally. He thanked me for my service, said he hoped I'd reconsider, and mentioned that my institutional knowledge would be hard to replicate. I found that interesting, given that 3 months earlier, he told me my way of doing things wasn't the only kind of value. I gave 4 weeks' notice. I documented everything I was supposed to document. I trained the 2 engineers on my team as thoroughly as I could in the time I had. I transferred files, wrote handoff notes, and answered every question that came my way. I left clean. My last day was February 19th. I started at Precision on February 24th. In March, I learned that Mercer had submitted a bid for a major Army Corps of Engineers project, flood control infrastructure along a section of the Great Miami River, $28 million. I had worked on the preliminary scoping for that project 2 years earlier. I knew the Army Corps personnel involved. I knew the technical sensitivities. I had not been contacted about the bid, which meant Kyle was leading it. I didn't hear anything more about it for a few weeks. What I heard instead in early April came from the Army Corps project manager I'd worked with on a drainage project back in 2019. She called me, not to talk about the bid, but to ask a general question about a technical standard she was working through. We talked for about 20 minutes. At the end, she said, almost as an aside, "Hey, are you still at Mercer? Someone named Kyle reached out to us last week and couldn't answer some pretty basic questions about the Corps' review criteria." I told her I'd moved to Precision Structural. There was a pause. Then she said, "Good to know." That's all she said. But I've been in this industry long enough to understand what good to know means when someone in procurement says it. In May, I found out Mercer lost the Army Corps bid. They weren't even in the competitive range, which in federal contracting means your proposal was so far off the mark they didn't bother to negotiate. The Army Corps doesn't hand out those designations lightly. That's a significant failure on a significant proposal. I also learned, through a former colleague who still worked at Mercer, that 2 of the state DOT project directors we'd had long-running relationships with had reached out to Mercer's leadership asking who their new technical point of contact was going to be. Apparently, the conversations hadn't gone well. One of the DOT directors had flat out said she wasn't comfortable proceeding without familiar technical oversight. Mercer ended up losing the renewal on one of those state contracts, $11 million. DOT awarded it to a firm that had previously been a distant third in that relationship. Then something I didn't expect happened. The Army Corps project manager I'd spoken with in April called me again in late May. She wanted to know if Precision Structural was positioned to submit on a modified version of the Great Miami Flood Control Project. They'd rescoped it, and it was going back out for bid. It was now $31 million. I said I'd talk to my colleague at Precision and get back to her. My colleague's response when I called him was, "I've been waiting 2 years for something like this. Let's go." We built the proposal over the next 6 weeks. I led the technical sections. I knew the Corps' priorities. I knew the specific geotechnical considerations for that corridor. I knew the inspectors and the review criteria. We submitted a proposal that was, without false modesty, the strongest technical submission I had ever been part of. We won the contract in August. $31 million. Precision Structural's largest single contract, and the project that Mercer had effectively handed us by thinking that relationships and technical expertise were interchangeable with management theory and a new software platform. I won't pretend I wasn't satisfied. I was, but not in a petty way, or at least I've tried to be honest with myself about the difference. I wasn't satisfied because Mercer lost. I was satisfied because the work I had spent 22 years learning how to do was recognized and rewarded. That matters. It matters a lot, actually, when you've spent a year being told that your way of doing things has limited value. There's a postscript, and I'll share it because I think it's instructive. In October, the VP left Mercer. I don't know all the details. What I heard from my former colleague was that the combination of the Army Corps failure, the DOT contract loss, and some other internal issues had created enough pressure that his departure was, in the polished corporate phrasing, mutually agreed upon. Kyle was reassigned to a domestic construction project management role, which, honestly, is probably where he should have been from the start. He might be good at that. He was never going to be good at federal infrastructure. The CEO called me in November. I was surprised to see his name on my phone. We talked for about 15 minutes. He didn't ask me to come back. I think he knew better than that. He did say that he'd made some mistakes in how the transition was handled, and that he regretted not listening more carefully to the concerns I'd raised. He said it directly, without corporate hedging, and I appreciated that. I told him I appreciated the call. I meant it. I told him I hoped Mercer found its footing again. I meant that too. There are good people at that company. Engineers, project managers, support staff, who didn't make any of those decisions, and who deserve to work for a company that's making sound choices. I genuinely hope that happens for them. What I also told the CEO, and I want to share this because I think it gets lost in these kinds of stories. I didn't leave because of Kyle. I didn't leave because of the VP. I left because I raised concerns in good faith, through proper channels, multiple times, and those concerns were dismissed. That's the moment an organization tells you what it actually values. And when what it actually values doesn't include your judgment, you have two choices. You can stay and accept that, or you can go somewhere that will use what you know. I chose to go. The Precision Structural team has grown by 4 people since I joined. We have 2 more federal bids in progress right now, both of which I'm leading the technical work on. My colleague gave me an equity stake in the firm in September, after the Army Corps contract came through. I have a desk that looks out over the Ohio River on clear days, which I find I don't take for granted. My wife asked me last month if I ever thought about what would have happened if I'd stayed at Mercer. I thought about it for a second. Then I said, no, not really. She said, good. I think the thing I want people to take away from this, if there's something to take away, is not leave if your boss is bad, or get revenge on the people who underestimated you. Those are satisfying storylines, but they're not really the lesson. The lesson is simpler than that. In certain kinds of work, the kind where expertise is deep and specific and built over years, where relationships are real and not transferable on a spreadsheet, where the cost of a mistake is measured in concrete and load-bearing steel, experience is not interchangeable. It is not a legacy cost to be optimized. It is the product. And when an organization forgets that, the market has a way of reminding them. It reminded Mercer in about 6 months. I didn't need to do anything except go to work.